want to welcome you to this event sponsored by the Humanities Program, the panel on Indigenous Ways of Being. Much thanks goes to Reed Chapman, Renuka Gassane, Corey Anderson, Carolyn Ryden, Chris Asbill, and Kent Thompson for their support in making this happen. And I'm Leslie Johnson.
They're bright. I'm trying to look down.
We all come from many places to be at UNCA Asheville, and we acknowledge with respect the stolen ancestral homeland and the indigenous people who have been here since time immemorial. The land we are on today is the ancestral land of the Anakaduagi, more commonly known as the Cherokee. To the Anakaduagi, this land is known as Tokiatsi, where they race, and was part of a Cherokee nation, Salagi Ayeli, which covered as many as 108,000 square miles of the American Southeast as late as 1730 and consisted of 60 or more towns. This act of recognition is not enough to overcome the settler colonial history that has attempted to eradicate indigenous people from the history and consciousness of these lands. It is the responsibility and work of humanities to move these acknowledgments to action. As we know, humanities is not just history. Humanities shows us how history, philosophy, art, stories, and sciences from ancient times to today are woven together to give us our present shared reality. Today, humanities calls us to pay attention to the stories and voices that persist and resist, rooted in ancient traditions, reaching into the future. A relationship with Native communities that is rooted in relevancy, respect, and reciprocity requires making space to listen to contemporary Indigenous voices in and beyond the walls of the classroom, which has historically excluded these voices. We are honored and grateful to hear from our panelists today who will share their stories, their work, and the issues that matter to them and their communities. In the lobby, and your instructors have access to this handout and this QR code that has information on each panelist and includes links to their organizations and their work. But in order not to take up any more time, I'm going to step out of the way and hand this off to them. Let's give a warm welcome to Chanel Feather, Gil Jackson, Jared Wheatley, and Byron Tanisaka.
Yes, hello. Yate, Chanel Feather and Shien, Twadich Iniashla, Being Bushishchin. Hello, my name is Chanel Feather, and I just introduced myself in the Dene language, which is my mother's language, and I told you my name, and I come from the Bitterwater clan. That's my mother's clan, and my father's clan is the Deer clan of the Cherokee Nation. And I always introduce myself first in my mother's language because we are matrilineal, and I always acknowledge my first language of my mitochondrial DNA that flows in my blood. And as an Indigenous person, that's a huge piece of my identity, is all the way since the beginning of me, of my clan, they have been Bitterwater. So I always like to introduce myself in that way and make sure that I acknowledge my foremothers. And that's a concept that's kind of foreign in America a little bit because we're so patriarchal since the conception of America. But Indigenous communities are heavily embedded in the matriarchy. And so I always love to talk about that and introduce myself as a matriarch and make sure that I introduce my mother's clan, my dad's mother's clan. Traditionally, Navajo, the Neh people is what we're called. That's what we call ourselves. The Navajo name is actually kind of derogatory. My grandpa always says, "You're not Navajo, you're Dene." So you tell people you're Dene because that just means the original people. That's it, the people. Anytime that we're talking about our original Indigenous names, what we call ourselves in our original language, it's always just the people, because that's all that we are, is just the people. There's no hierarchy. We're the same as the animals, the plants, we're just the people. And so that's what I choose to make sure that I let everyone know that Navajo is a colonized term. Cherokee is a colonized term. That's not what we call ourselves. That's what Europeans called us. And because it was easier. It was easier to call us by those names, what they heard from their, European ears. That was easy for them to say, oh, they're Cherokee, that's what they're saying. Or, oh, they're Navajo, that's what they're saying. Or, oh, they're Lakota. All of those terms that you've learned in all of your history books are wrong. So I'm happy to be here. Shio, Danela Ugidale Dagwado. Hello, my name is Chanel Feather. That's in my Cherokee language, my dad's language. So I'm really, really happy to be here and with this panel. I'm really, really happy to just be able to have a voice here and be heard a little bit. I'm gonna pass it on down and let each one of these guys introduce themselves. They said, women first, please go. And I was like, oh, I was always taught elders first. No, but I'll go.
So let me ask, are we going to come back to you?
Yeah,
Okay,
totally.
okay. Shio, doi dagwadon, anijalagi, unadatscom, agwadatscoin, doi dagwadon, digi obligation, anikawi. My name is Gil Jackson. That's my colonized name. My Cherokee name is Doyi, which is outside or outdoors, and I think it's very fitting for me. It means as I said, it means outside or outdoors, and I probably spend about 60% of my wake time outdoors, either hiking or finding edible foods or digging roots or looking for mushrooms or camping or hiking. So I think it's very fitting that I was named Doyi. And I am of the Deer Clan, as Chanel is. We follow our my mother's side, and that's where I get my clan. My dad was Birch Clan, and my grandma on mom's side was Deer Clan. So it just follows the female all the way through. Just a brief history of myself. I teach here at the university, and for those of you that are interested in learning about Cherokees, I would love to have you in my class. And I teach the Cherokee language. I also teach some independent study courses on occasions. And I also teach at Stanford online. And so I think the big issue that I'll be talking about is the loss of our culture. But we'll come back to me in a few minutes. Jared.
Shio Diwado, Jared Wheatley. I'm Cherokee Nation, which is centered in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and you would know it maybe as the end of the Trail of Tears. I appreciate being able to sit at this table with these folks because we are focused on indigenous ways of being, and like Gil said, he'll speak to the loss of culture within our people. And as Chanel said, we'll call ourselves the principal people in the Cherokee Nation and the Cherokee language. And maybe what I represent up here is a little bit different than some of these folks. I more represent urban Indian culture and remembrance, what genocide and ethnocide can look like. There was a systematic attempt to erase our cultures, and just our survival and our willingness to be open and honest about who we are and where we come from is a form of resistance of that genocide and ethnocide. And so that is kind of what I focus on, but I am less learned in our ways than the folks to my right, and probably even to the gentleman to my left. Thank you for having me here today.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, okay. Alipuncha, Mashikunas, Juan Bracunas, estudiantes, buenos días, good morning. Nyuka Byron Tenesaka Guaman. My name is Byron Tenesaka Guaman. Y yo vengo de los Andes del sur de Ecuador. I come from the Andes, the south part of the Andes of what today is known as Ecuador, from Quichua Cañari community. And I am an educator. I'm involved in everything education, and to me that's important because with the history of education in my community, where we have been denied education, and then later on, once we were given education, it was a certain type of education controlled by the city folks. And so I am super happy to be here among other colleagues and friends. Cuchillita, como decimos en mi comunidad. And I will be talking about the land in terms of with a focus on migration, because when we talk about immigration or migration in today's time where we're at right now, it has a negative connotation stuck to it. And it was not always like that, because since 1492, migration has been defined and redefined by a group of people at the expense of other human life. And so before then, a lot of our brothers and sisters in their nations, in their creation stories, migration plays an important factor, and it's so beautiful. So I would like to focus a little bit on that today, on how immigration went from being beautiful and you're right, as a human, as an organism, to where we're at today, and the policies that make migration the way it is today. And so I'm happy to be here. I come from a community of basket weavers. I'll be talking a little bit about my grandma, because she raised me since I was 1 year old, after my biological mother, migrated to the US. And so to me that's important, because that is the force or the will that allows me to do what I do today as an educator. And thank you for being here.
Yes, yes. Awesome. Thanks, guys. I guess just a little bit about me. I grew up in Cherokee, just right over the hill over here, and born and raised in the Wolftown community at the very top of Soco Mountain. And if you've ever been to Cherokee coming from here, you've probably passed by my house. If you've driven through Maggie Valley, then you have absolutely passed right by my house. I grew up in a community called Rough Branch, and it is the roughest branch in Cherokee. Some people, I get a lot of, I've grown up performing. I come from a performing family. If you have seen, if you've been to Cherokee again, and you've seen any of like the dancers that are on the side of the road, probably 80% of those are my relatives. And I grew up doing that. So I mentioned that, I'm Dene. I'm a Dene woman, first by my matriarch, then I'm a Cherokee woman, and then I'm third I'm a Lakota woman. And all three of those, I like to say I'm an indigenous mutt. I'm about 95% indigenous, and the rest I can contribute to my great-grandmother, Minnie. She's a little bit of Scottish and Irish, and a little bit of that. I like to say my eyelash, but for the most part, I'm pretty well. If you look at a map, the Nez people are in the Four Corners Southwest area, Cherokee people are in the southeast area, and Lakota people are way up in the plains, like North and South Dakota. So you're like, how did that happen, right? Well, I have my great grandmother on my mother's side is just 100% Navajo or Dene, and then my dad's grandmother was full-blooded Zalagi Cherokee, and then her husband was full-blooded Lakota he was Sikanju from Rosebud. And so I credit him a lot for my family being performers. The powwow style, excuse me, the powwow style of dancing, indigenous dance, came from the Plains area. So you'll see a lot of maybe some Cherokees down there with headdresses. And my dad is one of them, but he's Lakota, so he's able to wear that. But a lot of when you go there to Cherokee, there's tourism, right? So like before we had the casino, we were very poor. There wasn't a lot of stuff. It was just a 1-2 lane road that went down the main town, and that was all that existed. Everything just closed down at like 8 o'clock, and this was whenever I was young in the 1900s. And in the 1990s, and so it's interesting whenever we like think about these things, because I'm only 37 years old. And but there has been a huge change in the last 30 years in our community, a huge economic boom, and it has really changed the whole landscape of indigenous life. And I continue to remind people in our small town right now, we're becoming a small city. And we're starting to get more and more, see more and more of those city struggles. And like an urban indigenous person, he mentioned urban indigeneity, and we're starting to see that, and that's only happened in the last 30 years with the casino. So, but when I was growing up, everything shut down at like 8 o'clock, and we could go to anybody's house, knock on their door, and they'd invite you in for dinner. Now, most of the time, we didn't lock our doors. So I grew up on the top of Soko Mountain, and very, very poor. We were in like, I don't know, low income housing, and where it was, I just remember it being so cold in the wintertime. We would have to close off our upstairs because we could literally feel the wind going through the walls. So I come from a very, very humble upbringing, from a 2-parent indigenous home, and they were pretty young. My parents were 21 with two girls under the age of 2, and didn't have their education. My mom went on when I was in the 8th grade to earn her master's in social work. And then my dad also went on. They both are Western Carolina alumni, and he got his degree. So when we talk about like unique indigenous homes, I came from a 2-parent indigenous home that both had their degrees, which was kind of uncommon in that time. And we're just talking about the 90s. And so my parents had such a huge, like a forward, vision of how they wanted us to be as young women. And my mother is, she's actually went to residential school. Her first language was Dene, and she went to Catholic residential school in the Arizona area in the late 60s, early 70s. And those were still around in that time. And I can remember whenever I was learning about like injustices in indigenous communities throughout the history of the United States. And I remember thinking and learning about the mass sterilizations that were happening with the IHS systems, Indian Health Services systems in the United States of America, and how they were actually, indigenous women would go to have their babies in hospitals, and they would literally sign all this paperwork to have their babies, unknowingly signing a sterilization consent. And so they would go in and have a baby, and they would leave with a hysterectomy and a baby. And this was happening in the 1960s all over indigenous country, all over Indian Health Services. And whenever we talk about genocide, that was a part of that mass erasure that was happening in Native country. And so when I realized that was happening in the 60s, and mostly in the Southwest with the Navajo people, with the Dene people, my mother was born in 1964, and she was the fourth. So she was the last. My grandmother had already had 3 before my mother. And then, so talk about 3 times, and they're very close, only 2 years apart. So she started having, I think my uncle is like 58, like in the 1958. And so my mother being born in 1964, I always am like, man, I like literally cried. I remember being about 12 years old and learning that and thinking I literally could have not been here because my mother could have not been here. And so when we talk about like mitochondrial DNA and generational trauma, like that's what was going on when my grandmother was pregnant with my mother. Whenever you think about that too, so I have a degree in biology, so I might nerd out a little bit, but when you think about it down to like the chromosomal atom, and whenever a woman is assigned woman in the womb, she is then given her eggs. And so that, therefore, means that my grandmother, your grandmothers, all carried you. Because we exist in our mother's womb at that time. So when we're talking about generational trauma, those children feel that inside of that womb. So in the 1960s, my grandmother was going through this mass erasure, oppression, genocidal wars in American land, indigenous land actually. And that's what was, existing inside of my DNA. Inside of my mother's DNA, inside of my sister's DNA, inside of all of our DNAs. And it's very interesting because like you're kind of like, oh, that didn't happen to me, or putting a face. Well, I'm sitting here as a 37-year-old woman, and I'm in existence. So when we talk about like resistance, an act of resistance, well, my existence is that. And us to be thinking 7 generations ahead, that's one of the reasons why I love doing these types of things. I love speaking and allowing, my voice to be heard because I'm actively resisting with every single breath that I take. So yeah. But I grew up dancing. I'm a powwow dancer. I dance jingle dress. It's a healing dance. And I also grew up playing basketball. Any ballers in here? I played some pickup over here at UNCA a couple times. I see you waving in the back. I saw some coming in, and I was like, there's some ballers. And I played at Montreat for 3 years. And I then went on to live in Chicago. And I played there in NAIA Division III, very small school, and graduated in 2009. And then I coached, I was an assistant coach up there for about 7 years. And I lived there and got my degree. I ran a restaurant, Egg Harbor Cafe, in the Chicagoland area. And then I went on, I was really missing Indigenous people. And I went on, in 2018, I moved to North Dakota. And I was a science teacher, high school science, on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation. I worked on the east segment with the Arikara people of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara tribal affiliates. And I was there for 2 years. And in 2020, I came home. COVID brought me home. You put a lot of things in perspective during COVID. And I really needed to be back with my family, back on my ancestral lands, in my homelands, and have been here since 2020. I worked at the Residential Treatment Center in his homeland area, in Snowbird area, called Konowoti as the cultural coordinator. And currently I serve as the education program manager at the Museum of Cherokee. I don't like to say Indians, so the Museum of the Cherokee. I know that it's like hard to understand because you see it everywhere. Welcome to Cherokee Indian Reservation, Cherokee Indian Hospital, Cherokee Indian. But we are not Indians. There are actual people who are Indians, and we are Cherokee. You know, we are. So I think that's just doing a disservice to. And disrespectful to the actual Indians. You know, it is called Cherokee, and we're actually not a reservation either. But we can all talk about all of those things, and I can go in the depth, but I don't want to take up too much more time. So go ahead, Gil.
You did good. I was enjoying listening to you.
Thank you.
Yes. You know, you wonder, how did mass sterilization happen? How can that happen? And there may be some of you that have a hard time believing that. At least I hope there's none in here that would think, oh, how could that happen? You wonder about that. And I guess you should also wonder, you know, what's happening with women's rights now. So it happened. Women's rights are being taken away now. So it does happen, and it's not that uncommon. One of the things that was also happening about the same time was that they had these boarding schools where Indian or Native children would be taken away from homes and sent to boarding school. And one of the things that, the intention behind it was that save the man, kill the Indian, get rid of the problem that we've gotten. If we can turn him into a white, brown-skinned white person who has, who loses his language, who loses his culture, who loses his religion. You think about that, and those things were happening about the same time. And I have friends that have told me stories about, I got caught speaking Cherokee or Tsalagi or Gaduwagi, and I got whipped. And I have friends that said, yes, I got whipped, and sometimes I got my mouth washed out with soap. And it's had a very detrimental effect on our community and our people. And some of it is not very good. I mean, we have some serious issues, and at the same time, she talked about our tribe is very, very prosperous, and you hear about the 1% having 99% of the wealth in this country. Well, our tribe is amongst the Indian native tribes in this country. We're probably the 1%. We are extremely prosperous. We have some issues with our tribal government, but overall, I think they do an incredible job. But one of the things that concerned me, probably even when I was in high school, was I would hear stories, and that my grandfather or my father would tell me about a place or a site, and he'd say, well, Jutugalahoe, better known as Hangover, which is a place over in Robbinsville. And he would tell me a story, and as soon as I was able to arrange some kind of transportation, I would hike up there, and I thoroughly enjoyed being outside being in the outdoors and being in creation. And I thoroughly enjoyed seeing clean water, clean air, beautiful mountains, beautiful leaves, and also I had been taught that the land will provide for you if we don't mess it up. And as long as we don't pollute it, the land will provide for us, and I believe that. So I would go and locate these places, and but it didn't seem like anybody else was too interested in learning about these places. So for the last probably 45 years, and I'm a little bit beyond 70 years old, I've been locating sacred and significant sites. And they're all over the place. Most of them are inaccessible, but there's many of them, many places that are significant and maybe sacred that you can drive to. But I was more interested in places where, nobody knew much about it. They were almost inaccessible, as I said earlier. And so since then, I've been locating places. Sometimes it's taken me 4 or 5 years. I remember when I was in grad school, I recruited some young kids and I said, hey, let's go find a cave that one of our heroes hid in during the removal back around the 1830s. And it took me about 5 years to locate that cave. And it's really not a cave, it's more of a bluff. But my point being, I was taking young people even then. And so, with the loss of our language, with the loss of our future, with women being sterilized, we were also losing these sacred sites, these sacred places, and very significant burial grounds. And we were also losing stories. So for the last 45 years or so, I've been involved in teaching young people, and not necessarily real young people, but people who don't mind being outdoors and who enjoy being outdoors, and taking them to these spots. And sometimes these spots will take a couple of days to get there, and at the minimum, at least a day. In some places, not. You could do it in a day. But that's what I've been involved in, and as well as I retired, or I quit working in a job, a regular job, back in 2013, I believe it was, and at least I tried to quit working, and I'm drawing retirement, so I guess I am officially don't have a job, but I do teach. My day generally will start about 7:30 in the morning, and I get out of teaching at 9:30. I go to another program till about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Monday and Wednesday and Fridays. On Tuesday, as soon as I get out of my class at the local high school where I teach Cherokee language, I come to Asheville and I teach a course at 11:45 until about 1:15, and then I teach another class at 5:15. So my point being, I'm heavily interested, I'm very concerned about the loss of our culture, which is our language, the loss of our sites and significant areas and sacred places, and the loss of our stories. And also at the same time, I'm taking people when we go into the woods. I'm teaching this plant right here is edible. This plant right here is medicine. And this plant, or this root right here, or this plant, you can dig its root and you can eat it and it'll sustain you. So that's what I've been doing day in and day out, and I'm getting to the point now. I'm still able to climb mountains, but I have a little bit more issues nowadays when I climb a mountain versus even just 10 years ago. So that's really been my big deal is. And I will tell you a story. I moved to Cherokee back, 20 years ago, and I lived all over the Southeast before then, Tennessee, Georgia, Mississippi, and had some interesting experiences in all of those places. But I moved to Cherokee, and a lot of people were talking about Medicine Lake, Medicine Lake, Medicine Lake. And I'd heard some stories about Medicine Lake, and I said, okay, where is it? And a lot of those young folks would say, oh yeah, it's just over the mountain. I said, well, how long does it take to get there? And oh, it doesn't take too long. And so I said, could you show me? No, you'll be able to find it. You just go to the mountain and you'll find it. And what does it look like? Oh, it's a pretty place, I mean, all kinds of stories that they would give me, lies really, and because they really were not able to tell me, and I really wanted to know where that place was. But I was working with a medicine man in Oklahoma one time, back about, I guess it's been 15 years ago, and he said, jump in the truck, I'm gonna take you somewhere. And we jumped in the truck and we drove for 10, 15 minutes, and he parked on the side of the road and he said, well, we need to get out, we're gonna hike a little ways. He took me to this place that had 3 creeks coming together, and three creeks coming together made a 4th direction, and he said, this is a very powerful place for medicine. He said, this is, there's nothing better than right here. And he taught me some stuff, which I'm not going to go into. But anyway, I was back home one Sunday evening. I was looking at my maps, because I said, Doe is my name, and it's because I spend so much time outdoors. And I have a lot of maps, because I do a lot of hiking. And I was looking at a map one time, and I saw these 3 creeks coming together. It made it look like a cross. The 3 creeks came together at right angles. One coming from the south, one coming from the east, one coming from the north, and it made a pool. And it flowed west. I said, that's it. That's it. After about 30 years of asking people, where is it? And there was no trail in there. There used to be a trail, and it's no longer maintained by the park. And it is in the national park. And just a side note too, I really don't follow their rules. If I need to gather medicine, if I need to gather food, as long as I do it in a sustainable way, I don't consider it stealing. I guess if they were to take me to court, my argument would be, you guys stole that from us. Yeah, so how can you prosecute me? I mean, you stole it first. So that's gonna be my defense. And so, as long, but I'm very respectful. But I'm respectful not to the national park, but I'm respectful to the creation and to the sustainability of these plants and roots and medicine and other foods that exist within the stolen lands. So anyways, the very next opportunity that I had, I went into this, I started hiking. There was a trail that went part of the way, and I just went through the woods and next to the creek, and sometimes in the creek, and I finally came to this place, and it was a pool. It was a pretty good-sized pool, and the 3 creeks that came together were no wider than this table, and probably no deeper than maybe a foot. And as I approached that pool, a rainbow trout, or some kind of trout, jumped up and kind of said, welcome. And I've taken young folks in there because I want them to know the place. I want them to know the stories that go behind it. And most of all, I'm interested in, that we would never lose our language. We would never lose these places that are so sacred to us. So, and this is the truth I'm going to tell you. And every time I've taken young people in there, that trout or that fish jumps up, and he doesn't say welcome, but that's what I consider to be an act of welcome when he jumps up in the air and comes back down. I did take a non-Indian person one time. He wanted to go, and he does a lot of work on trails, native trails. And And he had his GPS, and in the day, and this has been about 15 years ago, GPS units were about this, it looked like a bag telephone. And I know that most of you guys do not know what a bag telephone is because you're too young. But anyway, it looked like a piece of thing about like this, maybe a foot long, 3 or 4 inches wide. But that's what a GPS unit used to look like. Now you got them on your wristwatch. And it tells you elevation, it tells you a bunch of information. The GPS units in the day did that too. But anyway, as we were coming back out, I said, we're going to go up this creek. It's a little bit easier to get in and out, or to get out, but not easier to come down. So as we were going, as we were going into it, and he was taking these waypoints. I don't know anything about GPS, but that's what he said he was doing. I said, I don't think you're supposed to be doing that. You know, we're going to a very sacred area, and I don't think you're supposed to be doing that. He said, well, I'm not going to share it with nobody but Native people. And he's not Native. And so anyways, we're going up the creek, coming back out. He hollers at me. He said, Gil. That's my English name, Gil Jackson. And he said, hey, I lost my GPS. He said, I had it in my hand. And he said, the river just took it out of my hand. And in that particular spot, it was no more than the width of this table, no more than a foot deep, and we could not find it. And there were 4 of us looking for it for about an hour. And back in the day now, you got to remember, the GPS units were heavy. They would not have floated. And we just couldn't find it. And so that's just the story about Medicine Lake that I will pass on to my grandchildren. And, you know, I'm hoping that young people know enough about how to get there now that they would be able to take my grandkids when they decide that it's time that they want to see where their grandfather has been. So I'm going to pass it on to Jared, and we'll be open to questions after their presentation.
Appreciate that. Do you want to go? Thank you.
All right, so thank you, Chanel and Gil, for sharing some of that perspective and storytelling. So a little bit about my story, and my story starts with, and then I'll comment based on what you have said as well, but my story starts with my grandma. And so my grandma, or my mom, grew up in an hacienda system. The hacienda system, it's like a plantation or a specific area where there's a white city person who owns this piece of land, and he grows crops and all these other things. And indigenous rural people work there because, you know, they've been displaced and their lands have been taken. And so her whole family traveled from hacienda to hacienda working in these systems. And so in this system, you would, they would give you, the hacendado will give you a piece of land, a small piece of land, usually like a rough piece of land on a hill or somewhere that you can live, and you would have to grow the corn, grow whatever, or take care of the animals. And you'd have to give 2 days up of your week and work the entire day so that you can, in return, keep some of the grains and some of the maybe some milk or any little thing that you were taking care and harvesting for the hacendado. And so my grandma grew up in that system, and she would have to go and work since she had early memory in the system. Her parents did not know how to read or write, whenever she was, I believe, 13, things started to change a little bit. They started to also incorporate making bricks, and she worked in that, making bricks as well. And so later on, till the age of 18, about 17, 18, there was a big reform where the government passed some laws, and this happened throughout South America and Central America as well, where they gave if you've been living there for your whole life or for many generations, your family, you were given a piece of land. They were splitting up the hacienda system because older people had died who were descendants from the colonists. And often what would happen is that the church would end up owning a lot of these land because the older folks, in order to repent for all the things they've done at the last minute at their deathbed, they would give everything to church so they can enter the kingdom of heaven. and so the church ended up owning a lot of land in South America at one point. And so they ended up dividing the land, and the hacendados who were now living in the cities, most of them, they thought fast, and so they went and talked to the people living in these lands that their system of work was now illegal, but it was going to affect them, not the people in the hacienda. They were going to get a piece of land, but they made it seem like they got in trouble because now it's illegal work, and so they made some arrangements, and everybody was supposed to get a piece of land according to these laws passed. But what they also did was they got lawyers, and they made the folks, my grandma's parents, sign some documents saying that they didn't want any land and they just wanted some money. And so they gave them some money, and we never got the land where my family's been working for so many generations. And so that happened, and my mother was at the age of 18, and right around there is where things started to change, and now all of a sudden folks came to give education mixed with Catholicism in our communities. And my grandma tells me this story when I was younger, and often when my grandma and our elders do, they repeat the same story again and again and again and again. So throughout your whole life, I grew up hearing these stories again, and it's in the back of my head. But the first time I remember clearly was when my family, my grandma specifically, she would weave these big baskets and take them to the city, because back then there was not a lot of plastic containers. So back then you had to have some type of big container to harvest all the vegetables and the corn and everything. And so one of her things that were passed down from a generation to generation was basket weaving. Would weave these giant baskets. And so my grandma would go to the mountain and harvest some of the suro, which is a mountain cane, and she would weave these baskets. And there's a whole process. And one of my chores as a youth was to take the what do you call it? What's the word? Sheets, or whenever you take the cane and splits. Yeah, splits. Yeah, I would have to take it and put them in the river, come back, let them dry, and put it again so that she can weave. That's one of my chores. And so she would go and harvest them, bring them down, prepare them. It's a whole process, and weave these big baskets. And so. And back then, we didn't really have a lot of transportation, and often she would stack them very high. And my goodness, this woman had a lot of strength, and to this day, her hands are like paws. Like, you shake her hand, it's like a paw. So heavy, like her pinky is the size of my thumb. And so she just very strong hands, strong forearms. She would carry these big baskets and stack them up, and then we would start walking from our home all the way to the city selling the baskets. And so whenever she walked, she's a very talkative person, always talking, and so she would tell me stories of her youth, and while I was clanking onto her pollera, her skirt, and she would often reflect, but I was listening. She would reflect out loud, and I was listening. And I would look up sometimes, and she would be crying because of her story is very sad. How from a youth she had to work hard. She didn't get to have any childhood at all. How whenever she got married, ended up in a relationship, a very abusive relationship, and I was part of that at the moment as well with my grandpa, and alcoholism and all these other things, and so she would tell me how. And when she was young, that she was her teacher's favorite student. And so the teacher would often come on Monday, to teach in the community, and then she would leave on Friday. And so on Friday, she would like get a couple of her favorite students to help her take the stuff back to the city. 'Cause often they would have to walk out of our community from the dirt road to get to the main road. And so she would help her, and as time passed by, she was one of the brightest individuals in our community, and her teacher wanted her to go to college, which is like high school, and or middle school at that time. So middle school, high school, and so she gets so happy about talking about how she won competitions. She would go. The teacher would take her to like other provinces, and she would win like kind of like spelling bees, I guess, equivalent of that, and stuff like that, and she would be so happy. And so she loves learning until this, she's right now 74, and she's right now learning English. She loves learning, and like just learning everything. And so she talks about that, and how there comes a point where school ends and the teacher tells her family, her parents, to send her to the city to study in middle school, high school. And so her parents are hesitant because of Christianity and other things from colonialism at that time. They said that a woman's place was not in school, but at home, learning how to be a woman, how to be a wife, future wife for her husband. And also because if you go to the city, often what happens is you forget your indigenous background. You forget your traditions, your customs, your language. And that was already happening, and her parents didn't want that to happen. So it was kind of like a mix of everything, and so my grandma reflects on that, how her parents, she really wanted to go study, but her parents did not want her to go because of two reasons, which I just told you. And so she often says how her parents at that time cut her wings. They cut her wings. She says that. My parents cut my wings. I couldn't fly. And so, sorry. And so she talks about that, and ever since then, has been a lot of her effort into keeping our traditions alive. And you know, sometimes with the help of my grandpa, and sometimes not, because he was going through a lot as well from his upbringing. And so in every community, I would say rural communities, indigenous communities in South America, or just Spanish-speaking communities, there's always like a strong woman, a strong female figure in every community, who often is like always like cooking those meals, giving you support, emotional support, always keeping the family together, from my experience. And so my story starts with her, because she taught me a lot of things, including like the reciprocity that we have with the land, with the mountains, how you pay attention to the seasons, how you give something of yourself in order to get something in return, when it comes to, for example, growing corn or growing anything, where you have to put in your time, your effort, you have to make sure you take care of that plant, and in return, you're eventually going to get something, some food in return. And so constantly we have this idea of like, we live in the mountains, and so we take care of the mountain gives us water, we drink from the mountain, and eventually, when we grow the crops, we're also eating the mountain. So eventually, we become the mountain. So we're like walking mountain, little parts of a walking mountain. And so I always thought of that. And then, you know, eventually, when we die, we get older, or we die, we're gonna become part of the mountain once again. And so that's our way of thinking for a lot of Andean indigenous communities in the Andes of Ecuador. And so I was also going to comment on some of the things that Chanel has said, which is that when it comes to birth, right now, or in the past couple of years, or should I say, let me start with just since the beginning of our communities, people know how to give birth, and how in our communities, how to prepare for birth, and how to deliver birth, and all of that. And so what happened was that in a lot of the communities, things changed with the laws, and all of a sudden you had a permit so that you can, be able to facilitate birth. Which back then, like for example, I was born next to the kitchen with our neighbor, who she's in charge of like facilitating birth for a whole community, and she's still alive. But there was a switch where the government wanted to, capitalism. So now that you had to get a permit so that you're able to facilitate that in terms of safety or whatever they want to put it. But it's a natural right. We are human, same as you take a breath, right? And you should, if your community has that knowledge already, you shouldn't have to go to the city and apply for a permit and get these other things. And so eventually it became illegal, and people were being persecuted for not having this permit. And in order to get this permit, you had to have education, you had to graduate high school, you had to go get a couple years of education, all of these. And you're asking this from people who you've denied education to, and they don't even know how to read or write sometimes. But they're knowledgeable and facilitating birth, don't get me wrong. Mm-hmm. But it's so bizarre how these things happen, like you said. And so it upsets me that in different probably countries, this is still happening, where I think they call it here midwife. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's illegal because they don't have this permit, but they shouldn't have to get this permit because it's knowledge for so many centuries, millennia, who we've been here and living as human beings. And so I wanted to comment on that, and then also the when it comes to rights that right now our communities are resisting to, the rights, basic human rights, are also everybody's rights, right? Because right now our communities, right now even in my own hometown, we are resisting mining, and then the brothers and sisters in the Amazon, oil companies. And so mining and drilling of our what people see as natural resources, right? Because there's that concept of seeing mountains and seeing land and seeing water as resources. And so we also have to change that, because often what you're taught in school is that this is a resource, this is a resource, this is a resource, and you don't look at other ways of thinking from our indigenous ancestors, from our different nations, and where we see things as beings, as part of the web of things, right? You're just a little knot, and so a mountain, a hill, a river is also another knot in this web of harmony, of balance. And if you mess that up, things are gonna fuck up. So that's what's happening, I think. And so people's fighting for these rights to fresh water, to access to the land, to ability to facilitate birth, to a basic education, those are also your rights, right? Your rights, and also the rights of maybe you become a parent someday, or maybe you're an elder someday. Those are the rights. So people's fight is everybody's fight, not only for our community, it's for everybody. Mm-hmm. And so, let me see, one more thing I wanted, sorry, I put notes because I forget things easily. And so, and another thing, the freedom to self-identify too, so important in each community, because what happened and I often say that the history of indigenous people in South America is a mirror of the history in North America, but the only difference is that in South America it's in Spanish. So, and so that is what has happened, even with like names, right? You have all these names, these Spanish names, but the history of that is very similar to North America, where you have people taking away their kids from indigenous families. And whenever, for example, an indigenous family would go register their kids on the registry, often they wouldn't listen to their families, to their parents, or often they would say, hey, you probably want this name because you want your child to enter the kingdom of heaven. And so they would write their name for them. Or sometimes they didn't even know how to read or write, and they would just put like I don't know, Carlos or something, instead of the name that their parents wanted. And so a lot of these similar things that often we share among cultures is the struggle to fight, the struggle to resist and keep resisting, because it's still happening in a lot of places. And so when you take someone's right to the land, when you take someone's right to fresh water, when you take someone's right to education, right? All of these people have no other option sometimes than to migrate up north, and that's the story of my family. My mother had to migrate up north, and I lived with my grandma, who was my biological my mom, but then I had my biological mother who lived here. And so a couple years later, when I was the age of 11, she brought me here, and I was reunited with my biological mother. And, you know, it might seem like a sweet story, but to me, she was a stranger. And when I got here, I was scared of her, because to me, she was a stranger. I ran away from her. I didn't want to be in the house. And so imagine seeing your baby, and he's scared of you, running away from you. And so this is these stories that happen because of the root. If you want to address immigration or migration, go to the root of it, which is policies, the government in South America, with governments from China, Canada, and the US, with mining, oiling, so that you can have the latest iPhone. People are being pushed away from their communities in South America. Right now, they're trying to push away our communities, my community, for mining. And so, thanks for listening.
I appreciate you sharing. I appreciate everyone up here. You've heard about the matriarchal system within our culture, but there's also another facet to the way we operate, which is that if an elder speaks, you listen, and you listen for as long as they'd like to speak. That's a big thing. And if you look at this table up here, I am a baby culturally compared to everyone who sits at this table. As I said earlier, my family story differs from most folks up here in the sense that I was born in Kansas City, Missouri, which is not a part of the land of the Cherokee Nation or the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. It's an urban center. My grandfather was born in Welling, Oklahoma, which is to the east of Tahlequah, and was sent to boarding school, Seneca boarding school, when he was 6, and was part of what Chanel spoke about, which is that the systematic removal of language and culture from the household. Grandpa's mother was not Cherokee. His father was Cherokee, and I think that may have played some role in the way that he reflected on himself within the community. Seneca boarding school is also not a Cherokee boarding school, obviously. So he was an outsider within that community himself, which is regular. That was part of the plan. That is what the goal was, to kill the Indian and save the man, was to either remove them from the land, like Chanel's mother being sent far away from our ancestral lands, to do that. And you have elders in Cherokee, North Carolina, who will speak about being sent to Pennsylvania or New York, to some other land to remove them from that. As we've already discussed, we see ourselves as part of the land, and the land is part of us. That will happen to you when you've been somewhere living a subsistence-based lifestyle for 11,000 years. So, you know, when I look at the people around me, I have tremendous respect for them, and I love to be able to share this time with them and hear their stories. And the story I bring is the story of genocide. I am, and my family is, an embodiment of what ethnocide and genocide looked like. We're a family that was removed from native land and removed from native language for generations, and it's been a great honor and pride of mine to be able to sit with folks who have stories to share and who share abundantly in our culture and our history. And you hear it here. Every step has been made to remove us and erase us. And it is difficult for Native and Indigenous people around this country to recognize their connection to their ancestral ways, because there's almost a shame in it to a certain extent, not only from the community around us, the white community, the settler and colonialist community, but even within our own communities, it can be very difficult if you haven't lived in those ways to reintroduce yourself. And that's what we call, being decolonized, or remembering, is standing up for the persecution and survival that everyone's ancestors faced for us to sit at this table. And our ancestors had to do different things. Everyone's ancestors, some may have gone up into the mountains and remained on the land and faced that. Some may have faced the Trail of Tears. Some may have faced complete detachment from their biological family, learned the ways, and then had to travel to a new territory with those ways and keep them intact. And I think if you reflect on the panel you've seen before you, you'll see that indigeneity is not a monolith. Indigeneity is a spectrum that we are all working towards every day, remembering our ancestral ways. I think even the first language speakers that I've had the pleasure to sit with and learn from, they are working still, just like Gil is working on a daily basis to recognize the knowledge and the wisdom that's removed from an oral culture. You see, we rely on storytelling. It's not written, there wasn't a name for every mountain and every stream. There were names for these things that were important to our lives and our survival. And so you had to take time and honor the wisdom that was being passed down orally. The Cherokee are lucky to have had a syllabary established and a written language established early with relation to other nations in the United States. But even ours is very disconnected, and we can only imagine what it would be like if our oral tradition had continued on for another 100 years before we had a written tradition. And reclaiming that is part of what we're doing right now in front of everyone here, is showing you guys that we exist, we remain, we always will remain, and that no matter what obstacle is put in front of us, we're going to find a way to share those stories and acknowledge how we got here.
Shkeen.
We're open for questions. We're
Thank you
open
all
for
very
lunch
much
also.
for that. So if you have questions, there's a microphone here, or if you're closer to this, just for the sake of the recording, if you could walk up to the microphone there or here to ask your question. We have about 5 minutes. So if you'd like to come up. May I ask you a question that actually came up in class, and it's related to, while you're figuring out your questions and going up to the microphones, it came up in our class discussion on Monday, and since Byron, you brought up reciprocity and the idea of, we look at things as resources. So the question that came up was, how can we, in our classrooms, as educators, as students, Fox is sitting right here. How can we engage with indigenous culture in the material that we engage with, artwork, texts we read, the oral story traditions? How do we engage with them ethically and respectfully without being, the word that was used was extractive or exploitative? And this question is really for all of you is, how can we go about doing that? And then there are two more there.
So in my perspective, even though it's our indigenous practice, you guys are human beings too. You breathe same oxygen, so it is within your right to learn how to grow something. I think I would start with that maybe. Raise your hand if you've grown something successfully. Right? Is it easy or is it hard? It's hard, right? It's not easy at all. No, it's not. And so it takes time, effort. You have to observe the seasons if you're growing something out there, right? You have to pay attention to all these things. And sure, science helps, but it's something just humane to go out there and be present and maybe even to a spiritual level. Do a reciprocity of energy and prayer, and so I would say that with just your crops, and sometimes I feel like there might be cases where someone in this generation or my generation or can go their whole life without ever harvesting or planting something, which is so bizarre. I think that you would just go to a store and get your food, and you become so detached from a reality, and so yeah, I would say that, and just learn from the elders. Don't be afraid to reach out to people in their community. There's awesome people doing awesome stuff. They just need voices and a platform to be amplified, and you can help with that by listening and going and or even traveling too. You want to travel with, and there's a lot of places in South America where you can learn about the ways of living when it comes to reciprocity with our food, and how that is a right that you should have, and the knowledge that you should have, and everybody, not only within indigenous communities. So that's when it comes to food. I don't know if you guys want to add on.
I was just going to add to that. Where I work at the museum, we get a lot of people that just come in and they're like, hey, do you have an elder on site that we can just go and they can take us up in the woods and show us all kinds of plants and stuff? I'm really interested in that. I'm sorry, I don't just have elders just like chilling here that I can just call upon just to come out and just show you that. No, that's it's a little intense, but it's also very disrespectful. Also, we have people come up, oh, my great-great-grandmother was a Cherokee princess. And I said, oh, really? Wow. We don't even have princesses today. Princesses is our European concept, first of all. Second of all, we have ambassadors. We have cultural ambassadors. And that didn't start until the 1960s. And also, I'm glad your great-great-grandmother got to be Cherokee because mine did not. Because in that time frame, we were not allowed to be indigenous. So that's another thing that's problematic in our community. What I tell people is, you know what? Everybody's indigenous to somewhere. You need to start there with yourself. And go, if your ancestral lands are in Sweden, or in Scotland, or in Ireland, or somewhere in Europe, or somewhere in South America, or Australia, or whatever, go there, get reconnected first. Find out who you are. Find out your story first. And then whenever you come, and maybe it leads you back to Cherokee, but don't come and tell me your great-great-grandmother was a Cherokee princess and don't even know her name. Find out her name. Find out her story. That's how you find out how to come to and learn other cultures in a humble way, in a good way. And because that's your reconnection story, then you know how to approach me. You'll know how to approach anybody because you know who you are. And that is the essence of an indigeneity. That's the essence of life, is finding out who you are and finding that story. And that might take your whole life to figure that out. And I always talk about this too. We're indigenous people of America are so fortunate because this is our homelands. This is our ancestral lands. We get to feel that every single day if we weren't removed. People, Cherokee Nation people, United Band of Gadua Cherokee people who, or after their removal, grew up in Oklahoma. When they come back here to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, they 100%, they cry. Because they know that they know that they're home. And we try to welcome them home. There have been so many systematic oppressive, divisive ways that have been instilled in our everyday, like blood quantum. That's a systematic, oppressive, divisive technique that was used with the United States government to divide each of us. We are not animals with pedigrees. And but yet it still exists to divide us and be like, well, you're not 4/4, so I'm not listening to you. But that's not traditional. Like, traditional is being like, welcome home, brother. Welcome home, sister. We're glad you're back. Come and eat with us. It doesn't matter what color you are, what color your eyes are, what color your hair is. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. If you are home, you know it. So that's what I challenge each and every one of you. Go to your ancestral lands and see how that feels. Because that's how I get to wake up every single day in my homelands, and I get to feel connection. Do that first. Do your work first. And then we can meet at the same level.